I want you to try and hold two extremely different images in your head for a second. Image number one, you are standing in an ICU. It's quiet. It is, sterile. You hear that rhythmic, steady beeping of the monitors. You have doctors consulting the American Medical Association's Code of Ethics. Everything is very precise, clinical, and strictly regulated.
It's a world completely controlled by protocols, autonomy, and symptom management.
Right. Now, image number two, the Book of Revelation. The sky rolling up like a scroll, fire, brimstone, the four horsemen riding out, and an evangelist bracing for the literal end of the world.
Which feels significantly less controlled.
To put it mildly, it feels like these two worlds shouldn't even be in the same universe, let alone the same conversation. But today, we are deep diving into a stack of sources that argues these two extremes, the clinical and the apocalyptic, have a profound connection. We're exploring a concept called terminality.
It is a fascinating, if somewhat heavy, pairing. We've got a stack of documents here ranging from the AMA's official guidelines on end-of-life care, specifically looking at palliative protocols, and we're smashing that up against theological papers discussing spiritual terminality.
And the mission for this deep dive is to see if the medical model can actually inform the spiritual method. Specifically, our sources argue that palliative care, comforting the dying without curing the disease, is actually the perfect metaphor for how to have spiritual conversations if you believe we are living in the end times.
Essentially, the argument is this. If you believe the clock is running out on the world, your strategy for talking to people shouldn't look like long-term physical therapy. It should look like triage.
Which is a massive shift in mindset.
Yeah.
So let's unpack this. To understand the metaphor, we have to respect the reality first. We need to start with the medical side. We've got a document here titled palliative.pdf and another called amaterminal.pdf.
And I think we need to clear up a massive misconception right out of the gate. Because when I hear palliative care, and I think a lot of people are the same, I usually think, okay, the doctors are giving up, there's nothing left to do.
Exactly. I think most people equate it with hospice or just waiting for the end. But the sources are very specific that this is wrong.
Completely wrong. The definition provided in the source is critical here. Palliative care is specialized medical support intended to alleviate or reduce the severity of symptoms, pain, distress, anxiety, without necessarily addressing the underlying cause.
So you aren't fixing the broken bone or shrinking the tumor, but you are making sure the person isn't screaming in agony because of it.
Precisely. The goal shifts. It's no longer cure at all costs. It's about improving the quality of life for the patient and the family. And the AMA is very clear. This applies regardless of the prognosis. You can have palliative care alongside curative treatment. You don't have to be dying tomorrow to deserve pain relief.
Okay, but let's look at when things do get terminal, because that's where the metaphor we're building really takes shape. I was reading through the opinions in the AMA Terminal Source Material Opinion 5.1, 5.4. It reads like a legal contract, but the implications are they're deeply emotional. Opinion 5.1 talks about goal clarification.
That is the cornerstone of modern bioethics. Opinion 5.1 states that the physician's job isn't just to prescribe meds, it's to help the patient define what they actually want before things get critical. Because, and this is key, medical intervention isn't always the right answer for every patient.
It's avoiding the scenario where a family has to make impossible choices in a panic at 3:00 a.m., right?
Exactly. It's about agency,
Yeah.
which leads directly into Opinion 5.4 regarding withholding or withdrawing life-sustaining treatment. This is where people often get uncomfortable. The source emphasizes that a competent patient has the absolute right to refuse treatment, even if that refusal leads to death.
And we need to be clear here. The AMA distinguishes this from suicide, right? This isn't a patient saying, kill me. This is a patient saying, stopping me from dying.
Correct. The distinction is huge. The AMA focuses on dignity and bodily integrity. If a treatment is just prolonging the dying process, extending suffering without a meaningful benefit, the doctor is not obligated to provide it, and the patient is not obligated to accept it.
But there is a very fine line here, and the sources spend a lot of time on it. It's the concept of the double effect. I found this really tricky when reading Opinion 5.7 versus 5.8. Can you break that down? Because it sounds like a loophole.
It's not a loophole so much as it is the ethical boundary that holds the whole system together. Opinion 5.7 discusses sedation to unconsciousness, Imagine a patient in refractory pain,
Refractory meaning unmanageable.
any pain that cannot be controlled by normal doses of medication.
Yeah.
Nothing is working. In that specific case, a doctor can sedate the patient to the point of unconsciousness to stop the pain, even if, and here's the double effect, that sedation risks shortening their life by suppressing respiration.
So the primary effect, the intent, is pain relief. The secondary unintended effect might be a faster death.
Exactly. The intent is relief. Now, contrast that with Opinion 5.8 and 5.9. The AMA explicitly opposes physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. They view those acts as fundamentally incompatible with the role of a healer.
So sedating someone to stop pain is ethical, even if they die. But actively giving them a drug to make them die is a violation.
That's the line. It's all about the intent and the role of the physician. The sources emphasize patient autonomy and holistic care. You respect their values, you respect their culture, and you manage their exit with dignity. You don't hasten death, but, and this is the palliative mindset, you don't artificially prolong the suffering either.
Okay, so we have this framework established: dignity, autonomy, goal clarification, and the realization that at some point the cure is no longer the objective. The transition is.
Right. We stop fighting the inevitable and start managing the experience.
Now, this is where the deep dive takes a hard left turn. We're taking that clinical framework, the ICU, the morphine drip, the ethical codes, and applying it to the soul. We have a source here called divineautonomy.pdf, and honestly, it introduces a concept that scared the daylights out of me.
You're talking about terminal fixity.
Terminal fixity. It sounds like a sci-fi horror movie title. But the source is essentially asking, what if a person isn't just physically dying? What if their soul enters a terminal state while they are still walking around buying groceries and paying taxes?
It is a sobering theological concept. And they aren't pulling this out of thin air. They're pulling from the very end of the Bible. Revelation 22.9012.
Set the scene for us. This is the very end of the vision. Right?
Absolute end. The angel is speaking to John the Apostle, and he gives him an instruction that is the direct opposite of what the prophet Daniel was told centuries earlier. Daniel was told to seal up his vision because the end was a long way off. But John is told, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near.
Meaning the timeline has accelerated, the window is closing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then comes the text you're referring to. The angel says, let the one who does wrong still do wrong, and the one who is vile still be vile, and the one who is righteous still practice righteousness.
That is the part that stops me cold. Let the one who does wrong still do wrong, it sounds like. Resignation. Why would a loving God or an angel representing him say, just let them be bad?
The source explains this as judicial abandonment. But, and we have to connect this back to the medical side, it's actually the ultimate expression of the AMA's concept of autonomy.
How so? Because abandonment sounds negative.
Well, think about Opinion 5.4 again. A doctor cannot force a life-saving treatment on a patient who refuses it. If they do, it's battery, it's a violation. The theology argues that God respects human autonomy so much that eventually he gives them over to their desires. The source references Romans 1 and Psalm 81.
So it's not God pushing them away in anger, it's God acknowledging their do not resuscitate order.
That is a perfect analogy. The source calls it a cessation of probation. Just as a physical terminal diagnosis means the body has passed a point of no return, the biology is fixed. Spiritual terminality implies the will has become fixed. The person has solidified their character, they've chosen their direction, either eternal estrangement or divine fellowship, and that direction is now locked in.
That is terrifying. It's the idea that you can reach a point of no return before you're even dead.
And that is the eschatological threshold the source talks about. It argues that there's a time when the opportunity to change your mind simply expires.
Which brings us to the synthesis. This is where we answer the question, what do you do with that information? We have a source called spiritualpalliativecare.pdf.
This is where we combine the doctor and the evangelist.
The source argues that if you truly believe the great removal or the rapture is imminent, then the evangelist has to start thinking like a palliative care physician.
Right, because if the end is near, standard operating procedure doesn't work. If the world is about to end, every single relationship you have is effectively entering a terminal phase.
The source uses a really vivid analogy here. It says, if the evangelist believes they are about to be translated or removed from the earth, they are like a doctor who is about to be deported from a crisis zone.
Imagine that scenario. You're a doctor in a war zone. You know the helicopters are coming to pick you up in 24 hours. You can no longer start a 10-year treatment plan for a patient with a chronic condition. You don't have 10 years. You have 24 hours.
That changes the bedside manner entirely.
Completely. The source contrasts standard evangelism with terminal evangelism. Standard evangelism is usually the long game. It's about moral improvement, lifestyle changes. Hey, you should stop drinking, or you should really work on your anger. It's casual. It assumes we have decades to build a bridge.
But terminal evangelism.
It drops the lifestyle coaching. It focuses purely on the core gospel and the escape. The tone shifts from casual to urgent, tender, and direct. You aren't trying to fix their bad habits. You're trying to get them to the lifeboats.
There's a specific practical strategy mentioned in the text called the left behind briefing. I thought this was fascinating because it sounds almost administrative.
It does, but it connects back to the AMA's advanced care planning.
How so?
Well, in medicine, you leave directives for when you can no longer speak for yourself. The source suggests the evangelist should do the same. If the evangelist disappears, if this great removal happens, their past witnessing needs to become a map for the loved one who is left behind to navigate the ensuing chaos.
So you're literally leaving an in case of emergency file for your friends' souls. If I vanish, here is what is happening and here is what you need to do.
Exactly. It's viewing your current conversations as a legacy. You are planting seeds that might not bloom until after you are gone. But, and this is crucial because I can hear the listeners getting anxious, the source warns heavily against panic.
Right, the concept of palliative grace.
Yes, this is vital. Just because the situation is terminal doesn't mean you panic. A doctor doesn't run into a terminal patient's room screaming, you're dying, hurry up." That would be malpractice. It would cause trauma.
It would be cruel. The source argues the evangelist shouldn't lead with trauma or condemnation either. Palliative grace means offering the essential comforts: love, forgiveness, and the way home. The goal is to ensure no one enters the darkness without a final, clear, gentle offer of the light.
It's prioritizing clarity over argument.
Exactly. When time is short, you don't argue about politics.
Right.
You don't argue about denominational differences. You focus on the destination.
So we have the theory, we have the why, but what does this look like on a Tuesday? We have a final source titled evangelism.pdf that gives us the marching orders for the final ward.
This is the execution phase. And interestingly, for all this talk of apocalypse and urgency, it doesn't suggest standing on a street corner with a megaphone and a sandwich board.
The source agrees. It actually points to much more subtle relational strategies. It mentions relational authenticity or friendship evangelism.
And it uses the example of Jesus at the well, right? John chapter 4.
It's the perfect case study. Think about that interaction. Jesus meets a Samaritan woman. He doesn't start by blasting her with theology or calling out her sins, even though he knows them. He initiates a dialogue through a mundane request. Will you give me a drink?
He started with water, physical thirst.
And use that physical need to pivot to a spiritual thirst. The source argues that this relational depth is key because it builds trust. You cannot have a terminal conversation, a conversation about death and eternity, with someone who doesn't trust you.
The source also brings up Paul in Athens. I love this part because it talks about contextual sensitivity.
Right. Paul is in Athens, surrounded by idols. He doesn't start smashing them. He doesn't start quoting Hebrew scripture that the Greeks wouldn't know or care about. He quotes their poets. He uses their cultural markers to explain his God.
So for the terminal evangelist, this means you have to speak the language of the person you're talking to. You can't use Christianese jargon. You can't say, just be washed in the blood, because to a modern listener, that sounds like a horror movie.
Exactly. If the message is urgent, clarity is paramount. You have to remove the barriers of language and culture so the core choice is visible. You have to be understandable.
There's another strategy you mentioned, lifestyle evangelism. And I feel like this term gets thrown around a lot in church circles, but the source frames it visually.
It references Psalm 37.4, delight yourself in the Lord. The argument here is about contrast. The evangelist must embody the blessings of righteous pursuits.
So, look happy.
It's deeper than happy. It's about looking, complete, anchored. If the world is falling apart and you are panicking just as much as everyone else, if you're just as angry at the news, just as fearful of the economy, your offer of peace rings hollow.
It's the difference between a doctor who is frantic and a doctor who is calm. You trust the calm one.
Precisely. You have to show that the choice between life and death is visually clear by how you live. If you are selling peace, you have to possess it first.
And that calm comes from the final point in the execution strategy: prayer-saturated intentionality. Which sounds like a buzzword, but break it down.
It's the safeguard against being pushy. It means avoiding high-pressure sales tactics. The source is very firm on this. You don't use gimmicks. You rely on divine sovereignty. to draw hearers.
So you pray, you position yourself, you speak clearly, but you don't force it.
You can't. Going back to the AMA, you can't force a patient to accept treatment. You can only offer it. If you force it, you violate their autonomy. The spiritual source agrees. You cannot violate another person's will. You can only make the offer clear before the window closes.
It is amazing how well these two frameworks overlay. The respect for the person, the clarity of the goal, the urgency of the timeline.
It really is.
So let's recap where we've been, because we've covered a lot of ground. We started with the AMA. We learned that palliative care isn't about giving up. It's about clarifying goals and respecting autonomy. It's about managing symptoms and preserving dignity when the end is inevitable.
We saw how the AMA strictly forbids hastening death, but supports allowing the natural process to occur without unnecessary suffering. The double effect allows for comfort even at risk, but never with the intent to kill.
Then we pivoted to the theology, the concept of terminal fixity, that just as the body has a terminal point, the soul has a point where its choices are sealed. Let the one who is righteous still practice righteousness.
And we saw the synthesis. The evangelist is the spiritual hospice worker. If the time is near, the focus shifts from fixing the person's life, getting them to quit smoking or vote differently, to ensuring they know where they are going.
We talked about the strategies, the left behind briefing as a legacy map, the need for palliative grace, and the importance of being calm, relational, and clear channeling Jesus at the well rather than a guy with a megaphone.
It fundamentally changes the nature of the conversation. It takes the pressure off winning an argument and puts the focus on delivering a message.
Which brings us to the big so what for the listener, because we can talk theory all day, but how does this change how we walk out the door tomorrow?
It comes down to a concept mentioned in the spiritual palliative care source: epistemological humility.
That's a $10 word. Break that down for us.
Epistemology is how we know what we know. In medicine, a doctor usually knows when a patient is terminal. They have charts, MRI scans, blood work. They can see the organ failure. They can predict the end with reasonable accuracy.
Right. They have the data.
But the evangelist cannot truly know the state of another's soul. You don't know if your neighbor is spiritually terminal or if they're just having a bad decade. You don't know if the great removal is happening tomorrow or in 100 years. You don't have the chart.
So what do you do if you don't have the chart?
The sources suggest a radical approach. You treat everyone as if they are in the terminal ward.
Everyone.
Everyone. Because if you assume someone has plenty of time, that you can put off that important conversation for another year, you might be wrong. And the cost of being wrong, according to these sources, is eternal.
That brings completely different energy to a casual coffee chat. It's not about being morbid, but about being present.
It eliminates the complacency of, I'll tell them later. In a terminal ward, there is no later. There is only now.
That is a powerful and honestly a challenging place to land. So here's the thought we want to leave you with today. It's a challenge, really.
If you truly bought into this, if you treated your conversations today not as casual chit-chat, but as bedside visits before a departure, how would the tone of your voice change?
Would you be kinder? Would you be more direct? Would you listen more? Or would you just appreciate the person in front of you a little bit more?
It's worth thinking about.
Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll see you next time.